This is the fourth in our series of discussions on open source topics related to hardware and software in the music industry. This has been done in collaboration with Centopia.com. I really appreciate their help in bringing this together. If you want more information, you can jump over there and check out text transcriptions and other information having to do with music industry hardware, software, and open source projects. Thanks, and enjoy this discussion with Paul Davis. Okay, today I get a chance to reintroduce myself to somebody that I got to know a while ago. We had a chat at the NAMM show, but I've known him by reputation for a long time. His name is Paul Davis. He is kind of the head honcho behind the Ardour Project. He's actively involved in Linux audio as a concept and as a movement. He is, you see him speaking all over the place as sort of like in these different roles. He's an ardent supporter of open source, and I'm really excited to talk more about everything with him. So with that, I'm going to say hello to Paul. Hey, Paul, how's it going?
Hi, Darwin. How are you? It's great to talk with you.
Yeah, likewise. I'm glad that we're getting a chance to chat again. Why don't we start off, for those people that might not know your work or your name, why don't we start off by having you tell them a little bit about what you're working on?
Sure. Well, I don't want to go too far back in the past right now, but to talk about the stuff that I do now and sort of the immediate past of where that's come from, I guess about 20 years ago, I started getting involved in audio and MIDI programming. Somewhere along the way, there's a story maybe we'll get to, I decided that I should write a digital audio workstation, and started working on that at the very end of 1999. And much to my amazement and surprise, it's 2017, and I'm still working on the same project, which, as you mentioned earlier, is called Ardour, which is an open source digital audio workstation. Runs on Linux, which is where it was originally written, but also runs on the Mac and on Windows now. For me, it's basically it's a full-time gig. When I started working on this, I was in the position of not needing to actually earn a living from it. I've since transitioned into a place where art is now how I make a living. And I wake up and basically write code that's audio and MIDI related. That's what I do with most of my time.
Let's talk about this a little bit. The Ardour system is really quite remarkable. It's hard to think of that as being like the effort of some people. You know, we normally see DAWs and we think of them as having to come out of like corporate entities, just because they're kind of monolithic, and they represent a significant amount of effort simply to just pull all the pieces together and manage the changes. How are you able to do it?
Yeah, it's a good question. Part of me feels like turning around and saying I don't really know, but I can give a slightly more analytical answer that I think is probably the more interesting one. I think when I started working on Ardour, one of the most important points is I didn't actually have the full concept of what I was doing that I do now. The original goal was motivated actually by acquiring an RME Digiface audio interface in 1999, which, for those who remember it, was a 26 in and 26 out PCI audio interface for a computer. There was no device driver for it on Linux, and I wrote one and then realized there was no software that could really use it properly, and thought, well, you know, I should just write essentially a digital tape machine for it.
Right.
And that in itself is not that hard of a challenge. I think it took me a month or two to have a 24-track recording and playback system working. There were some interesting challenges in doing just that, but it's a relatively easy process, and therefore it's quite easy to get started without being intimidated by the scale of the task. But it quickly became clear that although there had been a couple of other products, there were a couple of other products around that time at least that served as just a tape recorder and playback machine. It's not a very useful piece of software like that. Most people are not that interested anymore in recording stuff and playing back literally what you recorded. And when we realized that we needed to add an editor, that was where both the collaboration with other people began, and also where essentially the immensity of the task started to become clear. I've been incredibly fortunate. You know, other people have chosen to collaborate, help, and participate with the project pretty much from its inception. And along the way, we've had somewhere in the order of 50 to 60 programmers involved with the project. Now, their involvement has varied fairly dramatically. Some of those people are people who've submitted just one patch along the way.
Hmm.
Some of those people are people who've stuck with the project for a period of several years and have just done amazing work. But I think it's very important to note that it hasn't been necessary for me to recruit people to work on the project. They've come to it themselves. And I like to believe that the way that open source and Ardour in particular has worked has meant that the project has been able to benefit from some really incredibly high caliber programmers who've been able to come in and just be way more productive than many of the people. I'm not trying to be negative about people who work in the audio software industry, but everybody knows that there's a spectrum of programming ability.
Right.
And I think a lot of the people that have come and stuck around the Ardour project for quite some time have just been really exceptional programmers, which I think has allowed us to sort of move forward much faster than an equivalent project in a typical commercial company might. I think the second component is that certainly for at least the first decade of the program's life, it was something that I could really put a huge amount of time and effort into. I'm not somebody who's very comfortable with blowing my own horn, so to speak, but people tell me that I'm a very good programmer. I'm not sure that that's necessarily true anymore, but I think, for the first decade of the program's life, I was doing a lot of really intense and incredibly productive work aided by these other people. I think for the last 8 years, we've had the benefit of some persistent input, again, from some really incredible other people. I want to give a shout out to two people in particular. That there's a guy called David Oberlard, who actually now works at Ableton. And David worked on the MIDI implementation of Ardour over several years and is just a really incredibly talented guy in so many ways. Had a lot of deep insights about how that stuff should all work that I think most of us didn't have until we tried to change how it worked and realized that he had really gotten some stuff right. And the other person is a guy called Robin Garius, who's been involved in the project for, I don't know exactly when Robin first came out. Well, perhaps 2005 or 2006, for example, thereabouts. And, the first thing he contributed was a video timeline. You just drop in a whole video timeline so you can, import a video and you get keyframes and you can do all that kind of stuff.
Right.
Robin is just an incredible programmer. I mean, he makes me feel like a complete newbie at the task. He's incredibly productive. And so with a team of people, even though people have come and gone over the years, we've just had an amazing team of people who have been working on this much more as a passion project than as oh my God, I have to get up and go and do my job.
Right. And
I think it's allowed us to just move really quickly. However, I would like to say that I think you were talking about the perception of DAWs and they have to come out of a company. And I think you and I have both been in and around the industry for a while. I think when you go a little deeper and you find out where the proprietary DAWs have come from, their story's not so different either.
Right. They come from passion projects, right?
Yeah. I mean, if you look at what, I don't remember his last name, I'm sorry, but Wolfgang, who's the guy who was behind Cubase and then Nuendo and now Studio One, there's this kind of a similar structure there where there's this one guy with a very clear idea of what he wants to get done. And he does an awful lot of the work. And then a team shows up and they start dealing with the bug reports and customer support and customer feature requests and so on. And so in some senses, I don't think we're necessarily quite as different. I also think it's worth drawing attention to the fact that Ableton Live started at just about the time that Ardour did.
Right.
And I know Gerhard quite well, and I think there's an interesting parallel there too.
Yeah.
We've stayed as an open source project. I work in a little office out the back of my garage. We don't do any marketing. Ableton employs, a couple hundred people, and they've changed the entire face of music making. So although I'm quite proud of the way that we've done things, I don't think we've actually been particularly speedy or impressive really in what we've accomplished. But I am happy about where we've ended up and where we are now, and also about where we're going.
Sure. I'm going to want to circle back to this because it's actually an interesting area to discuss. Before we get there, I want to talk a little bit more about Ardour proper, and particularly my interactions with it lately have been through a variant. I got kind of hooked partly because of some projects I was working on, but also because of my desire to dip a toe into Linux audio. I got introduced to the Harrison Mixbus, which is sort of like a spin-off of some sort from Ardour. I don't really understand what the relationship is there. Could you kind of fill me in a little bit about how that plays out or what that
Sure.
is?
Sure. Well, over the years, we've had a number of companies that have been interested in collaborating with or using Ardour as a technology base for one of their own projects. Harrison were one of the first companies to sort of start out down that road. And they've been one of the few companies that have had a really clear vision of how they could take an open source project like Ardour and turn it into a product that can raise revenue for them and function, a lot more like a typical proprietary product.
Hmm.
Now, Mixbus is not really a fork of Ardour in the sense that they haven't taken the Ardour code and just sort of gone off and run in some direction in some distance away from us. Instead, we collaborate with them intensively. And when I say intensively, I mean I'm online with guys at Harrison all day, every day. Their development process tracks ours very closely. And in fact, Robin Garius, who I mentioned earlier, is employed by Harrison as a contractor, and he does a lot of their development work. And he'll do most of that development work on Ardour first, and then we'll simply port the changes across into the Mixbus code base.
Interesting.
And they work very hard at trying to keep their code base aligned with ours, which can be quite a challenge, as we found with some other companies that we've collaborated with. Now, what Mixbus actually is, technically, is they've taken Ardour and they've kept it all open source. They've made two significant additions or changes to it. One of them is they changed the visual design of the channel strips in the mixer, so that it looks a lot more like a traditional inline console.
Right.
And that aspect of things is all open source. I mean, you can get the source code of Mixbus and you can see, how they went about doing that. The second thing that they've done is they've added a proprietary plugin, and that plugin is the engine that drives how their mixer works. And so the combination of those two things, which is the open source DAW with this proprietary plugin, is what gives you Mixbus.
Interesting. Okay.
And so they're able to continue working on Ardour as an open source project. So, when they have ideas for improvements and new features and so on, many of those, maybe even almost all of them, will tend to go to Ardour first unless they're really inappropriate. If they're somehow too connected with Mixbus's workflow.
Right.
If they're just generally great ideas, that they'll often show up in Ardour first, and then they'll appear in the Mixbus code base as well.
Right.
And they're also then able to continue to work on things that are related to their plugin, which is to do with both the internal DSP and also just the architecture that surrounds that. And so, for example, there's at least two significant versions of Mixbus right now. There's Mixbus 32 and 32C.
Right.
And the 32C model, for example, is actually a different version of the plugin that has a different set of DSP with more capabilities and so on in it. But in the meantime, that's being coupled to essentially the same code base that is driving Ardour and Mixbus combined.
So all you did then was like abstracted out the mixer engine so they could drop their version in.
To some extent, although I don't think this is probably an appropriate place for us to sort of get down to talk about actual source code constructs, but I will say that actually their level of integration didn't even involve that kind of change. The mixer architecture is actually most of the Ardour design is still there, but they've coupled it, to their plugin to provide for the user what is a very different kind of mixer workflow and experience.
Well, that makes sense for them since they're historically a really strong console developer.
Absolutely.
It would make sense for them to really have some very opinionated concepts about what should be right in that neck of the woods.
Absolutely. And I think that for me in the Ardour project, they've brought two major things to the table with Mixbus. One of them has been at a very high level, and in fact, I don't want to even say they. I'll just, there's a guy called Ben Loftus at Harrison who's been the project manager of Mixbus, from the beginning. And Ben has just somehow had an incredibly great grasp on what they could do with Ardour, which is something that has somehow eluded lots of other people in the industry who have looked at Ardour and said, "Oh, that looks really cool and really fascinating. What can we do with it?" And they've never been able to quite figure it out. And Ben has had this idea, and he's been able to stick with that. And the second thing that they brought to the table, which we've chosen to not do in Ardour, but I think as a contribution to the audio technology world, is to say, look, there are lots of benefits in the ways that traditional consoles worked, that although you can theoretically reproduce them in any DAW by setting up your channel strips and plugins in the right way and so on, we're going to kind of enforce that. We're going to take you back to the way that you would have worked on a traditional console, where all the strips have an EQ and a compressor in them, and
Right.
where the master bus always has saturation on it. Not because of some arbitrary reason, but because we've got years of experience demonstrating that this is how to get really great mixes. And the reports that we get, I see them to some extent, the reports we get back from users very much reflect that kind of experience, that it's not so much that you can do things in Mixbus that are impossible anywhere else. It's just that it happens much easier.
Interesting. Okay, well, that really helps me understand, because nobody seems shy to say that this is happening, but nobody really talks about it very clearly either. So I was curious about how that fit together, and that makes actually perfect sense. I'm curious a little bit about you. One of the things I like doing in my podcast is, when I talk to people, find out a little bit about their background and how they get to be where they're at. And there's some really interesting stuff at play here. I mean, clearly you have an interest and kind of an obsession with audio and music software, but given the level of what you have to do to create a product like, or a system like the Ardour system, you have some programming chops too, clearly. And you also dropped a little nugget about, kind of being able to focus on this without really having to worry about the making a living part of it. I'm interested in knowing, what's your background? What's the musical side of your background, or the recording side of your background? What's the technical or programming side? And how did you come to the position to be able to take on a project like this at all?
Sure. If we go all the way back, when I went to university, I was actually studying computational molecular biology. In fact, it wasn't even supposed to be computational, but I found I didn't really like doing lab work. And in the mid-'80s, you were beginning to see the emergence of sort of computational biology showing up as a thing, people doing sequence analysis and stuff like that.
Okay.
And I rapidly identified that as something I was much more interested in than chromatography columns and gel runs and stuff like that. I finished my undergraduate degree and went to the European Molecular Biology Lab in Heidelberg in Germany to start a PhD in computational molecular biology, and dropped out of that after a year. There are a variety of reasons why, but I think that the critical one for our conversation today was I really did find the computers more interesting than the biology. And in particular, I found the synthetic elements of working with computers much more interesting than the analytical elements of biology. And if I can just explain that for a moment, when you're doing biology research, you have an existing living system in front of you. And the challenge is, how does this thing work? And when you're doing stuff with computers, for the most part, at least as a programmer, that's not the challenge at all, right? The challenge is, well, we want to be able to produce something that will do X, Y, and Z. How do we build that? Right. And so it's a synthetic process where you're constructing something. And I psychologically found that much more satisfying than the analytical process that the PhD was taking me towards. So I dropped out of my PhD. I moved back to England for a while, got a job at a commercial research place in Cambridge. And that really got I had a boss there who was into open source, which is where I got connected for the first time with the open source movement and with the GNU project. He really forced me to be good. I actually met him earlier this year, again, for the first time in probably 20 years. And it was a good reminder of how much I owed him, in the sense that he just forced me to learn a hell of a lot of stuff. I worked there for about 18 months and then moved to the US and worked for some small companies in the US. Eventually, it ended up in the computer science department at the University of Washington, which was ironic. I'd applied there as a graduate student and had not been accepted. About less than a year later, I got a job as a staff programmer. And that was a lot of fun. I learned quite a lot, mostly to do with things like operating system internals and threading models and stuff like that. It was a project I worked on there. But in the end, the job was turning a little bit too much into sort of system administration. And I was much more interested in doing code development than I was in just being a system administrator. And then through an odd series of connections, to cut what could be a very long story short, I ended up being the second employee at Amazon.com. I joined that company in November of 94. My first wife was pregnant with our daughter at that point. So when I joined, I had told Jeff Bezos that, at some point I would want to switch to a 3-day week. And he was completely okay with that. I later found out that he had concluded on first meeting me that I would spend 24 hours a day thinking about work, which was probably accurate. So it didn't really matter if I was in the office or not. Anyway, I stayed with Amazon for a little bit more than a year, just enough to collect my first round of options. And I then left. And again, there were lots of reasons for leaving. Life with 2 parents doing 3-day-a-week jobs gets insanely hectic. I didn't like the direction that the company was going in with its internal culture. There's not much of a reason to expand on that, but it was just, I think Amazon's become famous subsequently for not having a particularly worker-friendly,
healthy thing,
workplace, and that was really becoming evident, within a year of its founding. So I left to become a stay-at-home parent, which is something that I had actually envisaged myself doing a lot of my life. And at the time, I thought I would just give up programming, to be honest. But a couple of years into being an at-home parent, I got encouraged by my first wife to sort of pick up some interest again. As a teenager, I had been deeply into electronic music. I was a huge fan of the whole Berlin School, Tangerine Dream, Karl Schulze, and so on. And I thought, well, maybe it would be fun to start trying to make some of my own music again. I got an Oberheim Matrix 6 and an effects unit, and I think a DERP sequencer and stuff, and started messing around with that kind of thing, and realized I needed to record on something. And thought, well, I've heard about this hard disk recording stuff that's going on. Didn't want to get a Mac because they seemed overpriced and not really worth the money. I'd taken a vow back in the mid-'80s with my first boss to not ever use Windows. We had been using Linux at Amazon initially that was being used for credit card processing. And I thought, well, okay, maybe I'll just get a machine and install Linux on it. And it just turned out that the software that was available on Linux at that time to do that sort of stuff was just completely inadequate. And in the meantime, I was also being interested in some sequencing and compositional ideas that I couldn't find any tools to support. So I started by just sort of writing some MIDI composition stuff. And then, as I said, eventually by 1999, the Army Hammerfall Igiface had come out. I bought that, and that was the point at which I sort of switched over from, I'm doing this because I'm interested in making music, to heading down the path of, I'm just going back to being a programmer again. I don't have any particular musical skills. I mean, I had learned piano and flute, when I was in school, but I never functioned at all as a musician. And any music that I make tends to be that sort of sound field, wall of sound type of effect that Syntopia listeners, I'm sure, will be very familiar with. But I think probably, I don't know, certainly 10 years into working on Ardour, I've started saying to people, I realize I'm a much better programmer than I am a musician. And I think I'm probably going to just stick to what I'm good at doing. It's ironic that after all this time, I've now actually implemented all the tools that I really needed.
Only 18 years later, right?
18 years later, right. And I have a little bit of interest. I find it very difficult to find the time to put into actually trying to make music. One of my goals for the next few years is to actually try to change that around a little bit and actually try to get back into making some music myself with some of the tools and technology I've created.
Very interesting. So I'm a little bit curious, first of all, about this idea that you started off in computer-focused biology, and that was sort of how you got your start. Now, what is it that drew you to that? How did you get into it? That seems like a really bizarre choice.
The steps along the way that I remember, there's sort of like 2 or 3 steps really, and that was it. My stepfather worked for British Telecom, and I remember going in to his workplace a couple of times, and they had a mini computer. This would have been in the late 70s.
Okay.
And they had a mini computer that I got to play. What was that game called? Space Wars, I think. It's a very early computer game.
Yes.
I thought that was incredible. I don't know why, but I just remember thinking it was incredible. So it was like, okay, that lodged computers in my mind as a thing.
Sure.
And then when I was at university, I was taking a course in Fourier synthesis at one point and went into the library, which is the only place that they really had easy to access computers at that point. This is like the very early 80s. And there was a guy clearly running a Fourier synthesis program on the screen to build up letter shapes. Mm-hmm. And I found this amazing because, we were doing the theory of how you would do this, and it was incredible to actually watch it actually happening on the screen.
literally
Uh,
unfolding in front of your eyes. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, unfolding in front of your eyes. And I mean, I chatted with this guy, and he was sort of working on the software, probably written in BASIC or something. And then the third component was a guy I knew who had just gotten some very early British microcomputer, and we ended up writing some very simple program that drew black and white rectangles, either filled or unfilled,
Hmm.
on the screen, and made this thing that to us felt like, do you remember the wave makers from the 70s that would rock back and forth like oil and water?
Oh yeah,
and
right,
and it
right,
would create waves, and how you could sort of watch them, and people would talk about it was almost like being intoxicated.
right. Yeah.
And for some reason, this little simple program that just would draw a random series of random sized rectangles across the screen, and it would go over itself and over itself. And it turned out to have much the same effect. And so these three things sort of got me hooked into, hey, computers are cool. And then I think when I started, when I really got into my studies, I think as I sort of hinted at, I think the real reason for the switch was I just hated lab work.
Uh-huh.
It didn't interest me at all. It also struck me as ridiculously time consuming. People would have to come back at night to like turn off the gel column. Um, but here's the funny thing about that, really. One of the reasons I got into it at that point was to say, look, I can reach around the back of the computer and just turn it off and
Right,
go home.
right.
I don't have to come back at 11 o'clock to turn off the gel column. But what actually turned out to be true was that, as anybody who's done any computer work probably knows, I would sit at the computer just saying, oh, just one more minute. So I'm going to try this. And in the meantime, while my classmates had been off at the pub having a good time, and then would come back at 11 to just quickly turn off the column, I had been in the lab the whole time trying to get my sequence analysis thing to work.
Right.
And so it actually turned out to be quite the opposite of what I was originally aiming for, but at the same time, really compelling. And I think some of it is the control, taking the machine and trying desperately to make it do what you want. Some of it is the understanding of this sort of strange virtual world that you're creating inside of software. You build this thing that has these sort of abstract components that you think you understand, but it turns out that you don't really. And I find that aspect of software development really, it's a continuing daily stimulus for me. I do regret, however, that all of this programming stuff did pull me away from the music making, because music has really been it's a really central part of my life, even though I'm not a musician. There was a quote I just bumped into. I've seen it previously, but there's a Nietzsche quote: without music, life would be a mistake. And I think that very much sums up my relationship with music, even albeit I'm a listener rather than a performer. And so for me, connecting, creating software that people use to make and record music with my own work has been incredibly gratifying. To receive feedback from people who, even if I don't like their music, they're helping people to tap into their own creativity, their own vision of sound and musical flow and so on, is just so rewarding in comparison to the stuff I've done in the past, which is a lot more technical, a lot more system level type of programming. This is just sort of, it's a perpetual positive feedback loop. It just drives itself.
Yeah, well, I would say, being in that industry myself, I do have to admit that one of the real one of the hooks in it, one of the hooks that makes you want to stay in it is when you meet people and they hear what you do and they hear who you are and they beam because they immediately talk about how you changed their life,
Yeah.
right? And that's a pretty that's a pretty tasty hook, right?
It's a very tasty hook. And I think I've said to people a lot of times, how is it that in the image editing world, although it's changed a little bit in the last 5 or 6 years, I mean, still fundamentally there is one program, right, which is Photoshop.
Right.
It's even a verb now. But you go over to the audio world, and you've got a choice at this point of anywhere between a half dozen to a dozen flagship digital audio workstations,
Hmm.
all of which will get done what you want done. You've got another half dozen or so really good sound file editors. And yet, there are still programmers today who are starting out to write a new one,
Yeah.
and want to do their own thing. There's something about working in this domain that I don't know precisely what the feedback is, that keeps on stimulating programmers to like, I want to do my own, I want to
Yeah.
extend this, I want to do that, in a way that does not seem to have happened for the visual arts in the same way.
Yeah, that is pretty curious. And I wonder, one of the things I notice is when I talk to a lot of people who are doing programming work in the audio world, one of the things they talk to about the allure of programming is this sense of creation and creating things at sort of an elemental level that end up having kind of extraordinary results. And I think that audio programming is one of those things where that can happen pretty easily, right? I mean, you
Yeah,
can
I think
go in
that's
and you
true.
could just mess around with an audio buffer a little bit and get astounding results and results that's not going to be easily duplicated by a plugin or something else, you know?
Yeah.
You can do idiosyncratic stuff fairly easily.
There's that. I have to say that for myself, I mean, one of the things that a lot of people are quite surprised at when I talk to them about precisely what I do is I would actually claim to be a complete neophyte when it comes to signal processing. I really have had very little to do with that kind of programming. In fact, if anything, I would say my own strengths are much more as a system architect
I
than as
see.
a signal processing guy. But I would say that there's an element of the same kind of thing at work going on there, which is, when I get system architecture correct, and then somebody says, can you add this feature? If you got the architecture correct,
Yeah,
the ease with which this new feature is added is just a complete joy. You
right.
know, if you got the architecture wrong, you just butt your head up against the wall and you're like, oh, why is this so hard? Why did I get this wrong? And I don't know if that taps into the dopamine pathway or something like that, but there's something, that pleasure of realizing and recognizing that you got the design right
Hmm.
because you are able to experience its flexibility and its capabilities and the way in which it can be malleable and made to do a variety of things that you hadn't necessarily anticipated. And that is also an immensely powerful draw, at least for me, certainly.
Sure. One of the things that I wonder is when you sort of chose Linux kind of by default, it sounds almost, in that, especially in that time frame, the late 90s, yeah, Mac systems were underpowered and overpriced and pretty disappointing generally. You had this pact against the devil, I guess, is what it would be to not use Windows. So you sort of like there wasn't much left except, this burgeoning Linux environment.
Mm-hmm.
But how could you do that when at that time, you would have looked around and said, wow, there's not any here?
I think it was because I, I don't know. I mean, in 1999, 1997, 1998, we were only at the very beginning of people doing audio work in real time on computers. I mean, it was happening. I don't want to pretend I was like in the vanguard of that, but in terms of, easily available products. I mean, I remember at the time, like Pro Tools, for example, you could run it on a Windows machine, but they would only certify it on a single piece of hardware
Right,
made
right.
by IBM. I mean, that was sort of how novel it was to be able to do this kind of stuff. And so the whole kind of in the box composition model that we have now, and in particular, the model that Ableton Live is just promoted and made incredibly powerful and popular. I mean, this really didn't exist at that point. And I think I saw most of my music making goals as happening outside of the computer. I saw the computer mostly as a tape recorder and possibly a sequencer.
Hmm.
Those things didn't really seem too difficult. I'm a programmer. Hey, I'll just write my own. It's only really when we started to have to get into the editing, and then now as we're beginning to run up against the sort of workflow again that Live and now Bitwig and Fruity Loops and so on have made incredibly popular, and there's more of a demand for, well, can we do this with Ardour? Running into our limitations there, that I'm starting to run into the fact that, okay, so this is not actually quite as trivial as I may have thought right at the beginning. But at that point, it was sort of like, well, Linux is a platform and has a sound API, and I can make it go beep and bloop. In fact, I remember, I think the thing that really convinced me I could do it was using C Sound, probably in about, I don't know, 78 or something.
Okay.
And there was a composition by Kim Cascone called
Yes.
Blue Room, which you ran C Sound and it ran for, I don't know, a minute and a half and got a 30-second piece out of it or something. These sounds were just incredible. I mean, these hybrid instruments, the blended gongs and flutes and stuff. And it's like, wow, I can do this on Linux. There's going to be no problems. So I think that was the reason that, as I said, the workflow wasn't tied into like plugins and, time stretching and the whole groove oriented thing that people are doing now. I think for somebody who's starting out now, and I have to sort of give this advice on a daily basis to people who say, like, can I use Ardour to make music? And the first thing you have to say is, well, what kind of music do you want to make?
Right.
Because if you do want to do this kind of groove-oriented, plug-in centric kind of thing, At this point in time, Ardor's probably not the right tool for you. It's not that it can't be done. We have users who do it, but Ardour at this point is still oriented towards people who want to record themselves or other people playing instruments.
Yeah, it's oriented towards linear arrangements, right?
That's right. Mm-hmm.
So let's talk about the Linux audio world a little more, because you are kind of a vocal spokesman for that world.
Mm-hmm.
And it's getting some legs, it seems. Earlier this month, I talked to Andrew Belt, who's put together this VCV rack system.
Oh, yeah.
Which is a shockingly capable modular synthesizer emulation. And he is a ardent Linux guy. He does all his development on Linux. The fact that it works on other systems is nice to him.
Yeah.
But for him, the fact that it's a Linux thing is really, really important to him. Ardour has definitely matured to the point of being an extremely capable tool. And there are a lot of other tools that are coming along too that are at this professional class level. For people like me who've always been on the commercial end or have always used Macs or Windows, there are a lot of questions still. And one of the first ones is, how do I even get started, right? Because Linux has got this scenario where it's got, there's like 400,000 distributions,
Mm-hmm.
none of which are clearly the ones that I, as a musician, would want to use. Secondly, if I search online about audio interfaces for Linux, I'm scared into thinking that I'm going to have to get a 10-year-old M audio interface because nobody really talks about it.
Right.
And so it's a little scary, right? And there's almost like there's this gap. Getting onto the island is like such a long gap. I'm just scared I'm going to fall into pit in between, and I'm not sure that ends up being artistically satisfying to me in any way, right?
That's correct. Yeah.
What is the actual entry scheme? If somebody was like to come and hang out at your house and say, dude, just help me get started, what would it look like?
So there's one very important thing which has really changed in the last few years, and we have to thank Apple for this. That is iOS. It doesn't have any drivers. One of the things this has meant is that pretty much any USB audio interface that comes out these days, because they want to be compatible with iOS, they have to make their devices class compliant. So this has had a really beneficial impact for Linux, even though, as you probably discovered, it's not visible really when you do your internet searches. We're at the point now where almost any USB audio interface that you go buy is going to just work on Linux. You won't even have to think about it. And that goes all the way from, a little 2-channel DAC all the way up to like a Behringer X32 with 32 channels of I/O. I have a Motu Ultralight AVB sitting in front of me that you just plug in, it just works. iOS is just the existence of iOS, and also, I guess Mac OS 2 having its own class compliant driver, but I think iOS in particular, where the manufacturer cannot say, oh, download the driver.
Right.
That has really changed the whole landscape for audio interfaces, and it's unfortunate that we don't have a good way of conveying that reality to people, which is essentially, if you go buy a USB audio interface now and you ask the guy in the store, will this work with my iPad? And they say yes. You've got a 99% chance at this point it's just going to work on your Linux box. So the audio interface side of things has gotten massively better, although somehow we need to find some way to make it clear to people that this is actually the story. Of course, the story is a little bit more complicated than that, because USB is still not really the best way of bringing audio in and out of a computer. But for the vast majority of people, the issues don't matter too much.
It'll serve the purpose, right?
It'll serve the purpose, yeah. Now, to go back to the bigger question, as you mentioned, there's 400,000 distributions or whatever it is. This is where things get really problematic. Ubuntu is by far the most visible, first-time Linux user try it out type of distribution. And unfortunately, I don't think they're particularly worse than the other distributions for this purpose, but because they're so widely picked up by first-time Linux users, we just get to see the result of them not doing a particularly good job of having things set up for people that want to do music creation, pro audio, that kind of stuff. The easy answer that we try to tell most people that ask us on our online chat channels. There's a distribution called AV Linux, Audio Visual Linux.
Yeah.
It's put together by a farmer from northern Canada, Glenn MacArthur. He does a fantastic job with it. AV Linux will, first of all, you can try it on a USB stick. So if you want to just download it, put it on a USB stick, and then just boot your machine from the stick,
right,
you can actually see whether things will work without doing an install.
Okay.
And the chances are everything will just work. It comes with Ardour, it comes with Mixbus, it comes with a whole bunch of, it comes with basically almost every tool that you can think of that you might want. They're already installed, and the chances are that everything is going to work right out of the box. If that does work for you, it's possible that you may have other reasons later to want to switch to a different distribution. But if all you want to do with that machine is audio work, then the chances are it's going to be a pretty good platform to stick with. Now, the flip side is, what happens if I do want to go with Ubuntu, if I've got other reasons for wanting to do that? Well, the reality is every Linux distribution can be made to work properly. It's just a question of how much work is involved in that.
I see.
And the distributions are very slowly improving what they do in this respect. But in a way, it's not unlike some of the things that we hear people saying about Apple these days, which is, right, these distributions are not focused on our community. Ubuntu it might not be the size of Windows, it might not even be the size of Apple, but it's a big Linux distribution. They don't really care that much about the pro audio music creation world. And so they're not really tweaking their distribution to have everything set up properly for us. And increasingly, this seems to be something that people say about Apple now. New versions come out and they've broken this, they've broken that. And that's the kind of experience a lot of people are having on Linux. So to get started, get AV Linux and try it out. And if that works on your hardware and on your platform, then you could choose to stick with it, or you could just use that as a launching point to maybe go off into some other version of Linux if you choose to do that. Buy a USB or audio interface that works with an iPad or works with a Mac without drivers. Mm-hmm. And it's 99% chance it's going to just work on Linux as well.
Well, it's funny because, as we're talking about it, I'm sitting here in my studio looking around, and I realize that I'm actually using Linux for audio already. Mm-hmm. It's just not on a desktop computer. I have an Akai MPC Live, which mm-hmm. is running a Linux operating system to do its thing. Yep. I have a couple of other things like the Novation circuit, and I have the Mod Devices effects pedal, which is they are very open about saying it's a Linux kernel that's tweaked for that function. I've got the Novation thing. I've got a bunch of other things that clearly have operating systems and clearly aren't running Windows.
No, and it's true in the large scale console world too. If you have got a Studer or a Harrison or a Lavo or Allen Heath, I'm trying to think if there's any other brands. Certainly, all of those brands they're all Linux powered too.
Right, but also you brought up a great point, which I think is increasingly coming true, which is that the mainline operating systems are, like Apple and Windows, are almost becoming antagonistic towards media developers. Right, I feel like we're getting sandboxed out of everything other than using GarageBand. I sometimes work, I work for cycling. We make a thing where people are supposed to develop their own versions of idiosyncratic software. How long is it going to be before Apple's like, that idiosyncratic software thing, that's not really useful to what we consider our normal users, so we're going to cut you out of that. I think there's a lot of concern of those things because it seems like that's the direction where operating systems are going. Do you get that sense at all?
I don't think I have any more. I think I probably have less authority to speak on that than you do. It's certainly, the impression I get from reading around in the relevant groups online, it's certainly the sense I get. I also remember way back in 2002, the first time I went to AES in New York. It was the first time I met the guys from Waves, who I subsequently had a pretty close relationship with. Mm-hmm. And one of the founders of Waves, Gilad Karen, was really excited to meet me. I was wandering around AES handing out flyers to people, trying to get them to think about using Linux. And so this was back in 2002, and Gilad was saying back then, the audio technology industry needs to have its own platform. We have got to get out from under the yoke of Windows and Mac OS.
Right.
Unfortunately, it hasn't happened. And it is beginning to happen. I think when you look at the direction that you can clearly see, say, Native Instruments, and even to some extent, Ableton, some other companies going in where they're heading towards dedicated hardware. There's all kinds of reasons I think why companies are doing this, but they're heading in that direction. You're going to end up with these boxes that and I know, and quite a few other people realize they're just a computer, like your mod pedal.
Mm-hmm.
But I think there's this huge resistance among users because somebody's just spent, let's say, somewhere between $500 and $2,500 on a laptop, and you come along and you tell them, "Oh, I'm sorry, but you know what? You can't really use that laptop, for our software. You need to get like a real music computer for that that runs a different system." And people are like, "What?
Yeah,
Are you serious?" Yeah. And so, even though Linux has been a viable option in this realm for quite a long time, the idea of telling people, "No, I'm sorry, but your regular laptop isn't going to cut it," it's just not a feasible thing for the industry to do. I think maybe 10 years ago, 15 years ago, when people seriously talked about this is going to be the year of the Linux desktop, I think we could seriously imagine that one day that it might happen that people would actually be running, there'd be lots of Linux desktops and lots of Linux laptops around. I don't think that's realistic. I don't think that's a thing that is going to happen now. I think for people who are interested in Linux, who are interested, they have their own particular grievances with Windows or the Mac, I think Linux is a great platform to jump off of, although I want to add a quick caveat in a minute. But it just doesn't seem likely to me that we're going to get to a place at any point in the foreseeable future where companies like Cycling, companies like my own, companies like everybody else, Ableton, and the whole industry is able to turn around to people and say, no, I'm sorry, but no, you don't do that on your regular computer.
Right.
I think they will sell you boxes that work maybe better than your laptop does at that point.
Yeah.
And people will be happy, but I don't think it's going to switch. The one thing I want to stress to anybody listening to this, the biggest issue that we run into with the Ardour world of people who decide to come over to Linux is if you have a workflow that is built around plugins that you use on Windows or the Mac, then our advice at this point is, if those plugins are central to how you work, then you should stay on that platform.
Right.
And that's really the biggest impediment. Plugin developers, we have the hosts now. We even got a couple of commercial. I mean, we've got Bitwig on Linux now. But plugin developers not making their plugins available on Linux is now, I would say, the biggest impediment to people who would like to use Linux as the platform.
Yeah, I think that's actually a great point because what we do see, and I even see this when I interview artists and composer producers and stuff, is that a lot of times now their primary discussion about the tools they use isn't even the DAW or the interface or any of that stuff. They talk about plugins. The plugins have almost become the instrument and the studio tool that they use to define their work.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, they certainly are the instrument, that's for sure.
Yeah, right.
And the qualities of the instrument are going to dictate so much about what they do.
Good point.
And I think then that there may be specific elements of the way that a host will let you do sequencing or compositional stuff, but I think for a lot of people, I think a lot of people have evolved. I mean, they've picked their DAW because it supports their compositional style. And that then becomes just part of the wallpaper of their world. What happens then is, well, oh man, there's this really cool new instrument that, that I can do these kinds of modulations on and has these amazing sounds and control structures. And that's what they then become focused on, just because the DAW, the host, whatever, just fades into the background, really.
Right.
Which in a way is a great thing, right? I mean, I was saying some years ago, it was clear to me that at some point the workstation it's a commodity product, right? You buy it, it does what you want. It's not that interesting.
Well, I think that really it was Cubase and Ableton Live that did that. That basically said you're gonna how like with a computer you sort of like fall into the screen, right? You become part of that environment.
Yeah.
And they were the people that basically said, you're going to fall into our environment. It's not going to really matter what the machine is, who's got the label on the front of the machine. It's this environment that you're going to fall into. And I think that does put us in a pretty powerful place.
I think it does. And I think the fact that as the years have gone by, it's become increasingly clear what the functionality that people want out of their digital workstations is.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, we still have some variations, from door to door. There's some that are better suited for sort of linear mode stuff, and some that are better suited for sort of a loop and groove oriented things. But essentially, we all know what they're supposed to do now. And so to some extent, if one of them doesn't do that thing, that's just a flaw in the workstation.
Right.
It's no longer really. I mean, okay, so people prefer, some people say, well, I can't really do the stuff that I want to do with Cubase, so I like to use Fruity Loops because you can do this and that with it. There is some workflow stuff like that is still a pretty big difference between them.
Right.
But if you pick a particular part of the production process, whether it's tracking or it's actual composition, or whether it's mixing, whether it's mastering, and so on, you pick your workstation and you know what tools it needs to have. You know how it's supposed to work. And if it doesn't have those tools, then it's just no good.
Right.
And I think that's really different than the situation was absolutely in the mid '90s. I think even in the early 2000s.
2000s, right? Yeah. If your workflow didn't fit the machine, it was a you problem, not a machine problem.
That's right. Or it was a case of, well, you have a workflow that is really totally different and not covered by this kind of tools. Right. It was like, obviously you should use Samplitude for what you're doing. Whereas I think, most people now, other than this linear / loop groove thing,
right,
it doesn't really matter what tool you use. They're all going to do pretty much what you need. You maybe prefer the interface on this one, blah, blah, blah. They become a commodity. And
right.
I think for users, that's just 100% a good thing.
Sure. So I'm curious, my time is already up, and man, I could talk with you all day. But one of the things I'm curious about is what's next for Ardour? I mean, you obviously are putting a lot of time into it. The recent releases have been pretty phenomenal. I mean, it's great that MIDI came into play. You've got some pretty incredible user interface updates that have happened recently. What's up next? What are the things you're going to be pushing towards?
So we're currently on the development path for 6.0, which will be a major release, and it's a long way away. I don't want anybody to get the idea that it's around the corner.
Okay.
There are several things that I can say for sure are going to be a part of that. They're not necessarily that exciting for users as is, but they're going to be the basis for us to move on from. So some trivial stuff. One of the things that we're doing is changing at a programming level, and actually the user will be able to see, we're splitting apart the elements of the program that do recording and do playback, which will let you move them around in the signal chain, which will let you do things like do wet recording, for example. So you can choose to put the disc recorder after your plugins and so on. Right. That change also has a side effect, but very nice side effect, that lets us do cue monitoring, which, for those who don't know what I mean by this, Ardour right now, you can either, when you're recording, you can either monitor, that is, listen to the incoming signal, or you can listen to the existing signal in a track, but you can't do both. And although for audio, that's a pretty traditional way to work, it turns out that for MIDI, it just makes a lot of people's life very difficult. Cue monitoring will allow you to optionally listen to both the incoming material and material you've already recorded to disk on the same track. Right. So that will be happening. We have a complete overhaul of our latency compensation system, which will finally give us latency compensation everywhere. We've already had latency compensation in most places for quite some time. In fact, we had it years before Pro Tools did. But it will allow us to have it on our auxiliary buses and lots of other places now in a way that's deeply integrated into the whole system. There is a complete reworking of how we represent time inside the program. And this is a precursor to us being able to move towards more groove-centric compositional tools. I've already done the preliminary work on the first of those tools that we'll announce, which I hope will be a part of 6.0, which is essentially to get people to the point of open the program, add a track, set up a groove or a beat, if you like, and then do stuff over the top of it. Mm-hmm. And right now, doing that in Ardour is a lot more work than it is in a lot of tools that other people like to use, and that will become very easy and simple. But before we do that in the way that we really want to be able to do it, we need to revisit how we represent time internally. And that's proving to be a mammoth undertaking. So that will be happening. There will be lots of other things that will come along as a result of these changes. You'll be able to expect all kinds of things taking place in the user interface in subsequent versions of the 6 series. The initial release, though, is going to mostly be about this sort of technology switchover. And we'll want to get it out there so that people can start working with it and verifying that we've got our basic designs right. And then as the 6.x series continues, you'll hopefully see more of these sort of groove-oriented tools showing up. We're not going to try to chase Ableton Live or Bitwig or Fruity Loops because, we don't think it doesn't make a lot of sense for us to try to chase them. But we do think there are ways of incorporating their kind of groove loop-oriented outlook into a linear-oriented DAW that will be quite interesting for a bunch of users.
Yeah, that's actually, it's an interesting way to put it, because it represents kind of a different setting for what you're doing without necessarily abandoning what you've gotten
That's
good
right.
at.
As a performance, what to call it, inspiration, should we say, back in, I think, July, I got to see a new project by the lead singer of Alabama Shakes.
Mm-hmm.
It was the first outing. It was a 3-person trio, and they performed in Nashville. And it was mostly in a completely acoustic set. It was just, 3 women all playing plucked instruments and singing 3-part harmonies, which is sort of the perfect setup, right, for traditional linear workstation. You plug in the mics, you record things, except that on 3/4 of the tracks, they also had a drum machine, adding in a little bit of additional color to what they were doing. And this is something that in Ardour right now, again, it's not impossible. It's just it's a bit more complicated, and it requires a bit more head scratching than we would like our users to have to deal with.
Right.
And so, that's kind of one model of where we'd like to get to. If you're somebody who still plays instruments and maybe sings and stuff, but you also like to bring in some of these tools to help set up maybe just prototypes or maybe the final versions of pieces that you're working on, we want to make that integrate well into your existing linear flow.
Sure, that makes a lot of sense. Well, Paul, I want to thank you so much for taking the time. This was a great chat. I feel like I learned a ton. I now know where to go to whet my Linux audio appetite. But I also appreciate you talking in depth about Ardour, which is such an exceptional project. And thanks a lot for doing that as well, man.
Darwin, thank you for the invitation. I really enjoyed that conversation.
Yeah, I did too. Well, with that, I'll say goodbye. Have a great one. Wow, that's incredible. Paul has really pulled together an amazing project, and it's really exciting to see where it's gone. I want to thank Synthopia.com for helping pull this together. As always, they've been incredible supporters for this podcast. I want to thank you, the listeners, too, for showing up each week, listening to the podcast, enjoying it. I really appreciate all the interaction I've had with listeners lately. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to drop me a line, ddg@cycling74.com, and we'll take it from there. Thank you so much, and catch you next week. Bye.